References to historians and volumes I mentioned tonight may be found at AtheistScholar.org, Biblical Criticism. The Christian Bible is a failure on all the points that its proponents claim make it relevant and necessary for our contemporary time. It is touted as a moral and ethical guide, as well as a history of God and his special relationship with his chosen people, the Israelites. Fundamentalists maintain that it is an inerrant document, written and interpreted by people with God's inspiration. It is bewildering and egregious that an ancient document, replete with violence, men and God's pathologies, child sacrifice, genocide, and assorted cruelty, should have such an influence over the current political and cultural scene. Biblical quotations and passages are used to excite prejudice and violence against gay people, women, doctors who perform abortions, disobedient children, and more. Politicians, media, educators, and religious leaders make use of the Christian Bible for their own ends, which are most frequently based on expediency rather than problem solving to create a more viable society. Fundamentalist Christians would dictate our morals by Leviticus. They would replace evolution with creationism. Advances in science, such as stem cell research, are opposed on all sides by religionists who cite the Bible to justify their objections to modernity. The Bible is used as a prop to maintain injustice in the name of God. We live in the 21st century with minds shaped by a document that has no extant originals and which was written by aggregates of scribes and religious advocates. This document was added to, redacted, translated, and interpreted by people in different historical periods who had different agendas and messages to deliver to believers. The Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament's gathering of its 5 most important books, including Genesis, is called the Pentateuch. It was finalized by the Deuteronomy scribe in around 640 to 609 BCE during the reign of King Josiah. It was added to and redacted over the years up to around the 2nd century BCE. The New Testament is composed of Gospels written approximately between 70 and 100 CE and epistles written between 57 and 67 CE, along with books of later dates. The earliest gospel was Mark. The writers known as Luke and Matthew based their gospels partially on Mark, but they seem to have borrowed heavily from an earlier writing called Quelle, the German word for source. This early source seems to have primarily contained Jesus' spoken words rather than narrative. Such a document is not extant. There are no original manuscripts for the New Testament. There are no original manuscripts for the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of earlier works. They are a collection of 972 texts from the Hebrew Bible and extra biblical material dating from 150 BCE and 70 CE. They were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ancient Greek, and are the earliest copies of the Old Testament that have emerged so far. Fundamentalist biblical scholars twist themselves into knots in their futile attempts to establish the veracity and similarity of the extant copies, but such scholars are at best mistaken, or at worst disingenuous. Most of the volumes on the book list at our AtheistScholar.org discuss the vast amount of various versions and copies of both Old and New Testaments. Our world perception is partly based on the compilations of a document for which we have no originals. This is not a fact that is discussed as openly as it could be in media reports, and certainly not from the pulpit. As a result, much of the public has a misapprehension that the exegesis and translations of the Bible are based on original documents. What are the morality and ethics of the Bible? Biblical scholars, religious leaders, and politicians routinely call for a return to the morality of the Bible. Attempts to discuss the errors of the Bible are seen as dangerous, as fundamentalists insist that people are not able to do without its moral guidance. C. Dennis McKinsey, in the Encyclopedia of Biblical Errancy, 1995, cites wholly repugnant practices and beliefs discussed in both the Old and New Testaments. Some of these practices are cannibalism, death penalties meted out without mercy or common sense, human sacrifice, including that of children, and denigration of homosexuality and women. McKinsey begins his volume with an overview of some of the main critical points concerning biblical study. He discusses the fundamentalist view of biblical inerrancy. He quotes fundamentalist biblical scholars about their fear of a slippery slope. They are worried that if there are a few admissions of biblical error, most of the Bible will become vulnerable to the same charges. He explains the Bible canon's origins. The Church Fathers gathered the New Testament writings together in 397 CE and voted by majority on the books to be left out and those to be left in. McKinsey explores the fact of the redacted or excluded literature from the Bible. There is a large amount of literature of this type, possibly 100 suppressed Gospels. The Catholic Bible includes the Apocrypha, but there is more excluded literature than that. The Christian world is evenly divided on whether the Apocrypha are canonical. Protestants find them full of errors, inaccuracies, and having no sign of their being inspired by God. Oh, is the main Bible more inspired by God? McKinsey discusses biblical authorship, quoting theist scholars as to their lack of information concerning the authorship of many biblical volumes. He goes on to write about original versions, none exist, and variances, thousands of manuscripts purporting to be accurate representations of the originals. Fundamentalists insist that none of the variant versions affect the material aspect of the Bible. Apologists also insist that one must know Greek and Hebrew to interpret the Bible correctly. But McKinsey points out that critics who know these languages still disagree. McKinsey finishes with interpretation. Apologists try to insist on literal readings, but even they pause when the passages are too fatuous. They also fall back on the non-issue of Christian martyrs dying for their beliefs and the attempts to ban or burn the Bible. Such arguments have no bearing on the truth of the Bible. After laying out a concise array of biblical criticism and its errors, McKinsey attacks the entire Bible based on its violations of scientific, mathematical, medical principles, and so on. He faults the Bible for its poor ethical positions, such as approving war and slavery. He cites the disgraceful positions of the Bible concerning homosexuality, human sacrifice, and intolerance, as we mentioned before. He attacks prophecy, showing how often it is false, and he questions why it would be believed even in theist quarters when God admits to having deceived prophets in the past. McKinsey is not easily refuted. He has taken a painstaking study of the Bible and has found it so riddled with textual errors that he concludes there is probably no truth in it. He passionately disputes biblical passages that claim belief in the Christian Lord is liberty. He denounces belief in Christ as slavery. McKinsey thunders that one may expect deceptive statements from a religion that proclaims misery is a welcome test of one's faith, lack of valid evidence for biblical teachings is a challenge to one's beliefs, and the remedy for ineffective prayer is more prayer. The Bible does not withstand McKinsey's erudition or his passionate denunciations of deluded belief. McKinsey's study is arguably the best compilation of biblical errors, wickedness, and inanity. The question of biblical ethics has been settled by objective scholarship. There is very little. What of the question of miracles and prophecies cited in the Bible? Even many theist biblical scholars believe that such reports are fictitious and do not take them seriously. The same can be said for outright inaccuracies and howlers in the Bible with regard to science, mathematics, geometry, the flood, and so on. Bart Ehrman has constructed a very fine, intriguing story that explains why what we think we know about the Bible is skewed. In Misquoting Jesus, the story behind Who Changed the Bible and Why, 2005, Ehrman discusses the fact that the Bible we read today is a copy of copies of copies, and so on. These versions were written by different scribes with different sets of skills and diverse motivations. Ehrman takes the reader through the early days of the Christian church when most Christians were illiterate. Letters from Paul and other church leaders were read to different communities as instruction. There were Gospels, only 4 made it into the Bible, apologies, and more. A former merchant, Marchand, donated money to the early church and compiled a canon of collected books that comprised the sacred texts in the mid-2nd century CE. He was later pronounced a heretic. He was agnostic. Scribes copied versions of sacred manuscripts and frequently made errors when transcribing a word. Ehrman makes an excellent case for how a small error or change can alter a text significantly and make it very difficult to get a clear sense of intent when studying various biblical texts. Scribes also made changes that they thought would make more sense. Forgeries were rampant at the time of the early church. Some scribes had a religious or political agenda when they altered text. Later on, the church altered text to reinforce church doctrine, which was decided in a series of councils, as we have said. Ehrman explains the methods used in textual biblical studies. He gives an interesting account of the Dutch humanist Erasmus's publication of the Greek New Testament around 1516. Erasmus's text became the standard for 3 centuries, the version that most Western European printers used. Erasmus had very few early manuscripts to consider, and many of them were from the late medieval period. Ehrman maintains that many textual critics are beginning to believe we do not have an original text for the New Testament, that there may not be one that is extant. His book is additionally interesting for atheists because Ehrman includes his journey from fundamentalist scholar to agnostic during the course of his biblical studies. Richard Elliott Freeman was a professor of Hebrew and comparative religion, and Who Wrote the Bible, 1987, he begins a quest for the Old Testament authors of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Torah. It is a fascinating journey and a literary and historical detective story. He manages to advance the documentary study of the Bible. We will be explaining this type of study and others in a while. By careful sorting out of word usages and other scholarly devices, Freeman comes to the conclusion that the first 5 books were several different works by diverse scribes. Freeman believes the 2 scribes who wrote the original versions of their people's oral stories and traditions were J and E. Each version was written from the cultural viewpoint of the people from which it came. One scribe was from Israel, perhaps an advocate of the priestly family of Shiloh, and the other was from Judah, an advocate of David's royal house. The Israelite kingdom fell, and a scribe combined both books. Then the priestly work came along in King Hezekiah's time, with the Jerusalem Aaronid priesthood in favor. This work was the P version and an alternative view of the JE combination, which had hostile views of Aaron, God, and history. In the age of King Josiah, the Shilonite priesthood came to power and put together a law code and a history down from Moses. The fall of the kingdom and Josiah's death caused the Deuteronomy writer to put down an account of the disaster. Who was the Deuteronomy writer who reconciled all the earlier versions of the Bible? Freeman believes that it was Ezra, the famous priest, prophet, and scribe. Ezra provided the form that would be handed down for millennia. Freeman discusses the methods and aims of Ezra. In all, his statements are interesting and backed up by formidable scholarship. A compelling aspect of Freeman's study is his thinking on how the man-made Bible has impacted human faith. Freeman explains how the combined E and J versions made the biblical story richer, more open to interpretation. When the P version was written, God became cosmic and transcendental. The God of J, E, and D pictures a personal God talking to people and moving about the world. The two pictures of God were brought together by the redactor to create a new balance. God was both universal and personal. Freeman explains the writer had other motivations, but the result was the Judaic and then the Christian idea that God is concerned with each person. God is also depicted as a loving but torn God. His mercy frequently delays or tempers his justice. Such a unique combination of biblical synthesis has influenced our contemporary sense of religion. But for atheists, is this such a good thing? And Freeman speaks about justice, but God in the Bible is frequently pathologically wrathful and unfair. Who wrote the Bible is an important text that is even-handed and respectful of the Bible. It is a splendid piece of detection of biblical origins and editing, but atheists will balk at his soft handling of Yahweh. Which brings us to our next scholar. Joe Edward Barnhart, in his excellent article, The Bible and Violence, in the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief, has categorized many types of violence portrayed in the Bible. Such types may be found in both Old and New Testaments. There is extermination, which the American Puritan preacher Cotton Mather partially used to justify killing Native American Indians in the 17th century. Mather cited Israel's alleged exterminations of Amalekites, Canaanites, Midianites, and other peoples with God's approval. The Bible describes the violence and mayhem both commanded and carried out by the God Yahweh. Barnhart characterizes such passages as the pathological rage of the deity. According to Barnhart, there is another type of destructiveness that can be described as cosmic dualism. Apocalyptic violence is excused by claiming the victims have brought it on themselves by refusing to believe in Jesus and Christianity. There are additional kinds of biblical barbarity. Barnhart cites example after example of violence visited on the Israelites, a type of cruelty designated as violence turned upon the chosen. Yahweh orders his people to carry out genocide, even in some cases slaughtering the innocent animals belonging to the enemy. Barnhart designates a particularly repugnant practice in the Old Testament, sacrificing children to God. He has some interesting thoughts concerning a type of biblical violence he calls blood sacrifice. There is a sense that victims of blood sacrifice possess ritual impurity, that they are somehow not genuine human beings, but agents of contagion and pollution. Barnhart maintains there is a connection between the everlasting torments of Christian hellfire with the ancient Judaic practice of human sacrifice by fire. A brief glance at both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible gives a lie to its proponents' claims that it is an essential moral guide for our modern world. How much suffering would be alleviated if contemporary society would adopt a secular ethical foundation based on reason and science rather than the biblical foundation based on vengeance, ignorance, superstition, and violence. There is so much excellent critiquing of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, in scholarly volumes and on brilliant websites, that I decided to focus on the categories of biblical criticism rather than attempt to add to a field burgeoning with experts and teeming with exegeses. This lecture will cite the various categories of biblical criticism as discussed by preeminent biblical scholars. These men of letters undertake the study of the Bible using the same methods of hermeneutics as scholars studying other academic subjects. Hermeneutics merely means interpretation. This category section of my lecture is dependent on Robert M. Price's Biblical Criticism in the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief, Jacques Berliner Blauer's The Secular Bible, C. Dennis McKinsey's The Encyclopedia of Biblical Criticism, and Hector Avalos' the end of biblical studies. There are 5 major forms of biblical criticism in the present day. Christian fundamentalists cling to the concept of biblical inerrancy. But this lecture will maintain that the Christian Bible fails to hold up under the scrutiny of any one of the hermeneutics discussed here. The 5 categories are historical criticism, source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, and criticism centering on the historic Jesus. Most critiques blend several of the categories, so the distinctions are not clear-cut. The first category, historical criticism, began as early as the 1440s, when Lorenzo Valla judged an important document called the Donation of Constantine, ceding the papal states to the Church in perpetuity, was a fraud. Erasmus, John Colet, Spinoza, Martin Luther, and John Locke were only a few of the important thinkers who insisted the biblical text should be studied as any ancient document according to the original historical sense and with rationality. Grammar and historical context began to be important to biblical studies. Later thinkers such as F.H. Bradley expected historical scholars to not only determine truth about a document's authenticity, but to have the ability to recreate a previous author's mindset. Understanding his viewpoint would help to judge what caused him to write or perpetuate falsehood. Such a determination could illuminate portions of the difficulties and thinking of each era scrutinized. The second category, source criticism, concerns the questions of authorship and the literary integrity of books of the Bible. Julius Wellhausen was one of the greatest source critics. In 1883, he advanced the documentary theory or method to maintain that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Judaic Torah, was not authored by Moses. Some theist biblical scholars had insisted that even though Moses' death was included in the narrative, Moses was still the author of the Pentateuch. They maintained that the inclusion of his death was proof of Moses' powers of prediction. For such types of critique, source materials are gathered and examined for differences in style, history mentioned, and so on. Source criticism was crucial in the scrutiny of the New Testament as well, determining how Matthew and Luke had rewritten the earlier Q document, which has never appeared. They were both quoting the Q when they transcribed the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes. The third category is form criticism. Form critics such as Hermann Gunkel maintained that the biblical scribes were not so much writers as compilers and collectors of traditional oral works, which they wrote down. I have decided to focus on form criticism, not only because my background in English literature gives me some ability to navigate this area, but also because I think it will be of help and interest to atheists. 2 very helpful critics of the present day are John M. Hayes, who authored Old Testament Form Criticism, and Gene M. Tucker, the writer of Form Criticism of the Old Testament. Most of the types of form criticism are attempts, in the words of the poet, to justify the ways of God to man, and are also attempts to explain vexing questions these ancient people entertained about their God, social relations, cultural traditions, and how things worked. As we know, this world of the biblical scribes, of course, was pre-science. How were they to answer such questions without science? They had a rich world of oral tradition, and many had poetic talent, and most of them were mentally inventive, and some had genuine literary ability. Form criticism's most well-known developer was the aforementioned Hermann Gunkel, 1862 to 1932. His work reminds one of the early deconstruction, the literary criticism that was dominant in the 1970s and 1980s, primarily in France and the United States. He found Julius Wellhausen's source analysis, which he only accepted in the broadest sense, was less productive than his own form criticism as an analysis of the Old Testament. This type of critique has also been used to eke out the oral traditions behind the New Testament, as we have mentioned, and shall see more of in a while. Gunkel believed that compilers and collectors of ancient oral traditions wrote them down, but modified them very little. There are scholars such as Bart Ehrman, as we have seen, that would disagree. In any case, even the formidable Frank Kermode, that giant of literary criticism, and other scholars point out that many of the scribes were very talented poetically and wove an earlier oral narrative into a story that made a satisfying explanation, not only in a pedagogical way, but also aesthetically and psychologically. Gunkel focused on Genesis, although these types of stories are found throughout the Bible. We shall discuss the 5 forms Gunkel located with examples. Put together with source and redaction criticism, they have greatly expanded our understanding of the Bible. Gunkel classified each by what questions the ancient people were asking. Max Weber, whose works we have perused in Atheist Sociologies in July, makes the point that many of the religious rituals practiced by people concern the here and now of the earthly world, and very little concerning the transcendent world that they ostensibly believe in and expect to gain at death. Earlier church rituals, still utilized in many parts of the world, and even still in the United States, focused on good harvest, good weather, calm seas, rain for crops, blessing of fishing boats, and so on. The governor of Texas not so long ago called for prayer to bring rain to the parched, drought-ridden state. From time to time, groups in Detroit, Michigan, pray for an end to crime in their beleaguered city. The early peoples who told stories and the later compilers of these stories in a biblical form were doing something similar. They were explaining the world of the here and now to their audiences and then to their readers. Gunkel firmly believed that the genealogies of Genesis have a definite function according to their form. He thought that such genealogies highlighted specific links between certain passages and also represented connections between covenant promises that were made by and with God to and with men. The covenant texts were apparently, when associated with Abraham and the patriarchs, in the pattern of written land grant treaties familiar to the writers and compilers. The Book of the Covenant, Exodus 20, 123 to 133, and the Book of Deuteronomy are patterned after classic Hittite sovereign vassal treaty texts. So we can begin to see that form criticism relies heavily on a text genre being indicated by its structural form. Gunkel also believed that the text was bound to a particular social setting and function. He tried to organize the writings of the Bible by genre. It is interesting to note that in addition, of course, to many previous and contemporary fine scholars in the field of German literature, he was also somewhat influenced by the brothers Grimm, the authors and collectors of fairy tales. They were also collectors of German folk traditions in general, and had classified them into distinct categories such as fairy tale, myth, saga, and legend. Gunkel found that introductory phrases and the form they took gave insight into the life situation from which they arose. He began to formulate questions to ask when analyzing biblical text. Who is speaking? Who are the listeners? What is the setting at the time? What effect is aimed at? He identified 5 major types or genres of stories in Genesis. The first category is etiological stories, why things came about. Some of these things might be remarkable, but others were often attempts to explain why and how the difficulties of mankind came about. The most important question is, why is there death? Why do we have to work for a living? Why do we wear clothes? What does the remarkable rainbow mean? What is it? Why do people hate snakes? Why are women regarded as lesser than men? And why is childbirth so painful? The The second category is etymological stories, which seek to explain by puns the fictional origin of names nobody understands any longer, or that the writer suspected or knew had pagan origins and needed a Hebrew explanation or foundation. Some of these names were Moses, explained in Exodus 2:10. The Pharaoh's daughter named the child Moses, which means pulled out, because she said she had pulled him out of the water. The name Ishmael is another example in Genesis 16:11. Ishmael means God hears. Yahweh's angels tell Hagar, the serving woman who has run away, that God has heard her affliction and that she should call her child Ishmael as a reminder of God's merciful interposition. The same necessity of making place names more orthodox applied. Bethel came about because God appeared to Abraham and later Jacob in a dream at Bethel. The Ark of the Covenant was also left there for a while. It was the center of a sort of cult culture, as people were there to ask counsel of God. This story is in Genesis 28:17-18. The third category identified by Gunkel is the grouping of ethnological stories. These depict the relations between nations, tribes, and groups that existed in the narrator's day. The narrator presents each group as an ancestor, which of course is a fiction, who can be seen to depict the symbolic stereotyping of his or her group. In Genesis 9:20-27, Noah was drunk, and his son Ham did not cover him, but told his two brothers about it. The two brothers did cover Noah. When Noah understood what had happened, he decreed that Ham's descendants would be slaves of Japheth, which probably referred to Israel. This story explained why the future Israelites intermarried with Philistines, and why they both subjugated the Canaanites. The Israelites and the Edomites were neighbors, but they always quarreled, and that is because Jacob and Esau, Genesis 27:1-41, began their brotherhood with trickery and quarrels, and now it would seem that enmity is in the blood. Since Jacob and Esau made up some 40 years or so later, it seems strange that the Israelites and the Edomites could not do the same. From there, Gunkel moved on to the geological stories. These try to explain the origin of extraordinary landscape features such as a pillar of salt. Lot's wife looked back as they were leaving Sodom and Gomorrah, which was forbidden, and was turned straight away into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19-26. There were oases, such as in Exodus 1:17-6, when Moses struck the rock of Horeb and the water came out. And springs, Judges 15:18-19, when God split the rock for Samson and water came out. Still to be seen, the narrator tells us, in Lehi to this day. There were other stories to explain glacial megaliths and more. There are ceremonial stories. It has been noted by critics and scholars that most of the stories of Moses and Israel in the wilderness are about establishing legal and ceremonial precedents. Other examples are God establishing the regrettable practice of circumcision as a sign of the covenant between God and the Israelites. The Passover story, Exodus 12:21-22, is another ceremonial story. These narratives are used to explain the usually so-called sacred origin of customs or rituals that were so archaic no one really knew their origin, or the origin was known and the custom was pagan, so it had to be cleaned up with Orthodox rationale. Robert M. Price discusses an additional category, this time suggested by the noted anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski. This category consists of legitimization stories. Such stories reinforce the power of the state and its laws and customs. The story will tell how, at the very beginnings of creation, things came to be, and that God had created or ordained such a dispensation. Are we so egotistical and reckless, the story suggests, or says outright, to change God's order at this late date? Such narrations attempt to disguise the fact that humans have created the custom, and the explanations serve to hide the fact. I would like to mention again Eve's subjugation to Adam in Genesis and the justification of that story concerning the secondary place of women in society. There is a fine body of form criticism of the Psalms. It is necessary to remember that as the history of psalm writings progressed, psalms became literary conventions that were independent of the reality situation that called for each type. There is the prayer for help of the individual, which is first person and frequently opens with Lord. The petitioner asks to be heard and or helped, usually with a description of his trouble, usually in relation to God, others, and or self. These psalms usually promise praise or thanks of some type if help is given. There is the thanksgiving song of the individual. It gives thanks to the Lord directly and repeats why as a testimony to other worshipers. The Psalms, 150 in all, include hymns of praise, songs of instruction, a few on ceremonials, thanksgiving after battle, and so on. Form criticism made for the most intelligible reading and organization of the Psalms, in the opinion of many scholars. They were meant to be performed exclusively by the Levitical choristers on the steps of the Jerusalem temple. Some of the Levites also played musical accompaniments on instruments mentioned in the Bible. Although we will be discussing the historicity of Jesus this evening, discussing form criticism in relation to the New Testament seems to be an organic flow with the principles being discussed right now, and so I will segue into form criticism of the New Testament. Form criticism of the New Testament is invaluable also, although the dispute concerning possible errors by the great scholar Carl Ludwig Schmidt and others is a difficulty. Their work remains crucial, however, because Schmidt revealed the Gospel of Mark, probably the earliest of the Gospels, had a wholly inaccurate chronology. It was a sewn-together document coming from several previously independent traditions. Scholars had relied on Mark for their lives of Jesus, but Schmidt exploded that prop for what it was. Form criticism is responsible for exposing Mark's New Testament gospel as inauthentic, a skeleton to hang several oral traditions on. One thing has definitely survived the controversy, and it is crucial to an explication of the Gospels. Carl Ludwig Schmidt put forward a theory which maintained that gospel forms were passed down in oral units, and no detail was preserved in writing unless it served a set purpose, such as Jesus' messianic lineage. Nothing was preserved that did not have a practical, theological, polemical, liturgical, and so on use. Robert M. Price has provided a well-documented examination of the disputations surrounding the concept of form criticism. The entire section is worth reading for the clarity it brings to the issues involved. Once again in the Bible we have genealogies, which this time seek to legitimize Jesus' messianic lineage. The form critic's job was to find the Sitz in Leben, which is defined as a sociological matrix in which each piece of tradition was preserved or created by the early community, or in other words, the life situation at the time. I will just go over a few types of these stories before I get into an interesting facet of the New Testament, summed up by the great secular critic Burton Mack. This facet concerns the kerygma, the saving message of Jesus' cross and resurrection. But first there are the miracle stories, and it has been discovered that such stories are designed, as we just discussed, completely devoid of any material extraneous to the tradition. Each of the writers and the church wanted extraneous material scissored out, and it was done thoroughly. There are the pronouncement stories of Jesus, and they are largely for use as rules for ceremonial matters, such as paying 2 drachma for taxes, picking grain or nuts, or healing on the Sabbath, and so on. Law words is the legislation of the early church on various topics where there was a difference of opinion. Referring back to the miracle stories, which were also, of course, used to create and spread propaganda that would create belief in a divine Savior, Robert Price makes a point that such miraculous claims were very similar to those at the shrine of Epidaurus, where the miracle healings of the Hellenistic healer god Asclepius were posted for scrutiny by visitors. The healing and exorcism stories have been found to have an additional purpose. These were read on the days when there were attempted healings and exorcisms by later churchmen, possibly in the 3rd century, but also likely much earlier. The healers and exorcists read these stories that purported to be the same techniques and in the same words in Aramaic that Jesus used. They were obviously trying to convince the faithful, and perhaps themselves, that their rites would achieve their goals. As we have said earlier, many of Schmidt and Debelius's theories were disputed by critics, and some textual matters remain unsettled, unlike the general agreement among many critics concerning the critiques of the Old Testament. One crucial matter that was brought up by Gutegemans around 1970 could not be ignored. He said that the form-critical assumption that the earliest preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus that had found its way into the Gospels was not correct. Buttman and others had stated certain criteria concerning the kerygma and considered it of crucial importance. The term kerygma has come to denote the irreducible essence of Christian apostolic preaching. The ancient Christian kerygma, as summarized by Dodd from Peter's speeches in the New Testament book of Acts, was 1. The age of fulfillment has dawned, the latter days foretold by the prophets. 2. This has taken place through the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. 3. By virtue of the resurrection, Jesus had been exalted at the right hand of God as messianic head of the new Israel. 4. The Holy Spirit in the church is a sign of Christ's present power and glory. 5. The messianic age will reach its consummation in the return of Christ. 6. An appeal is made for repentance with the offer of forgiveness, the Holy Spirit, and salvation. C.H. Dodd finally tried to save matters by dropping the secondary material from the theory and saying that the kerygma was simply the saving message of the cross and resurrection. But this retreat emphasized that most of the materials, law, miracles, and pronouncements, and other matters reported by the Gospels had nothing to do with the seemingly all-important message of the kerygma. Paul never wrote on miracles and spoke of the risen Christ most of the time, and hardly mentions Jesus. Burton Mack, that illustrious biblical scholar and an atheist, has written a conclusion that will resonate with many other atheists. In A Myth of Innocence, 1988, he concludes, very sensibly, that much of the written material seems to be unconscious of or finds unimportant the kerygma of the dead and risen Christ. The kerygma might have belonged more exclusively than we realized, according to Christ, to the Christ call, which believed in and worshipped a Christ suspiciously similar to the shadowy Kurioi or Kyries, which were lords, saviors, and demigods of the Hellenistic mystery religions. More melding of the Christ legend with pagan mythology. But this lecture must admit a difficulty with Price's dependence on the earlier Q or Quella document. There is an assumption on the part of many biblical scholars that the Gospels of Luke and Matthew were based largely on a written manuscript that was not narrative, but a compilation of the putative earlier sayings of Jesus. There is a problem with such an assumption. Some of the biblical critics speak and write at times as though they know what the Q document said. There is little evidence for this document. There are claims that it is not spoken of by early New Testament writers or churchmen. Possibly, of course, they had their own agendas and did not want to mention a document which might contradict their purposes. Price, for whom I have enormous respect as a fine scholar, makes a statement that I am not comfortable with at all. He says, whatever community compiled this Q source of sayings must have been unconcerned with Jesus' supposed atonement and resurrection, since Q makes no reference to those things. How does he know this? There is no extant copy of this document. We do not know, but can only make educated guesses about its contents. I know scholars have been able to make connections concerning such a document and have done a fantastic service in teasing out what is said from the material available to them. But are we not going too far with our assumptions concerning its contents? One help with this thorny question comes from the discovery in 1945 of the Gospel of Thomas at Nag Hammadi. This is an early manuscript, possibly, but not necessarily in the Gnostic tradition. The Thomas Gospel is a compilation of the ostensible sayings of Jesus. It differs from the canonical Gospels of the Christian Bible, but it is some evidence that the putative sayings and preachings of Jesus were compiled into written documents prior to the Christian Gospel's narratives of the life and death of Jesus. If there really was a historical personage of Jesus, that is, which is more and more unclear. When confronted with studies of oral singers in the Balkans and other new insights into oral transmission, we must conclude that it is quite impossible to determine the authentic words of the possibly historic Jesus. Oral traditions do not proceed in a linear manner, as von Sina discusses. He says, a piece of tradition may well double back on itself, interact with written versions before it returns to orality, or be cross-fertilized with other telling, harmonizing as it goes. In other words, the oral tradition is seldom linear in its progress. One begins to understand Avalos' and Berliner Blau's calls to end biblical studies except as a branch of secular research. We shall see their opinions in a little while. It would seem the search for the true sayings of a man who may or may not have been a true historical personage has faltered, and many would say has failed. But now I will turn to another branch of biblical criticism, which has helped shed light on how errant this inerrant document has turned out to be under scrutiny. The fourth category of criticism is redaction. Redaction criticisms are examinations of what has been left out of Bible copies. There are many redactions in the Old Testament, but much of the focus of redaction is what the evangelists left out of the Gospels. There may have been as many as 100 books lost, according to C. Dennis McKinsey. Most of the redactions were for religious and political purposes, such as Luke's Gospel toning down the eschatological teaching of the earlier Mark Gospel. Since the end of the world did not seem as close as it once had, there was a shift in narratives. The early Christians believed there would soon be great destruction and death, after which God's peace and justice would be established in the world. When the apocalypse failed to happen, they changed their goal to establishing a just and loving community among Christian believers. McKinsey and others state that many books were kept out of the Bible because they did not have the advocates the other volumes had. McKinsey concludes that the church councils at Rome in 382, at Hippo in 393, at Carthage in 397, and again at Carthage in 419, fixed the list of books now present in the New Testament. The council at Carthage in 397 CE was especially influential, as we saw earlier in this lecture. It was such decisions determined by politics and by vote that gave us the 27 books of the Bible we have today. The search for the historical Jesus, our fifth category of biblical criticism. The question of whether Jesus existed as a historical person is very troublesome. Even discounting his putative divinity, it is difficult to make a truth claim for a real, though likely non-consequential preacher born in Galilee somewhere between 7 to 2 BCE. This historical personage was supposedly born of humble parentage, was a preacher during his young adult life, perhaps predicting the coming end of the world and the reign of God's justice on earth, perhaps preaching an ethical doctrine illustrated with parables and aphorisms. However, there is little evidence of a person who could be distinguished from all the roving preachers of that era. Because of the dearth of verification, it is possible to consider the Jesus figure a mythical configuration. Jesus often seems a metaphoric scarecrow on which many religious, political, and scholarly schools have hung concepts in accord with their own aims. Many scholars, such as Earl Doherty, The Jesus Puzzle, 2001, Freckin Gandy, The Jesus Mysteries, 2001, and R.M. Price, who has written several erudite volumes on the topic, see book list at AtheistScholar.org, have concluded that the supposition of a historical Jesus is completely mistaken. The rejection of a historical Jesus has been endorsed by Richard Dawkins, the preeminent biologist and atheist, and by Christopher Hitchens, both part of the new atheist movement. See Atheist Activism at AtheistScholar.org. George A. Wells has of late determined that a historical but non-important Jesus personage did exist. The difficulty of ascertaining any facts concerning the historical Jesus makes for enduring speculation rather than enlightenment. Robert M. Price lists some biblical historians' projections concerning Jesus. See the article, citation, and work cited, The Historical Jesus, at AtheistScholar.org. He finds that Ben P. Meyer serves a warmed-over Jeremiah, the biblical prophet. Meyer sees Jesus as a Messiah and a leader in a national repentance movement. Juan Luis Segundo makes an agitator Jesus of class conflicts. E.P. Saunders makes a case for an eschatological Jesus. James Breach creates a Nietzschean Jesus, while Marcus Borg modernizes Jesus even more, making him a charismatic leader of a movement grounded in spirit rather than in culture. In Jesus the Magician, 1978, Morton Smith thinks Jesus was a magician. It was not uncommon for roving preachers of the Jesus era to perform magic. John Dominic Crossan creates a hybrid Jesus that is part magician and part Greek Cynic-influenced philosopher. Burton Mack sees a significant correspondence between Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Mark, the early Q document, and Cynic philosophy's tenets. The Jesus Seminar is a current movement founded by John Dominic Crossan and Robert Funk in 1985. They are a group of around 150 scholars who vote to decide their collective view of Jesus. A brief description of the seminar's final picture of Jesus is that he was an itinerant Hellenistic Jewish sage and faith healer who preached a gospel of liberation from injustice in startling parables and aphorisms. The Jesus Seminar does not believe Jesus preached the end of the known world and a coming reign of God's justice, but that instead he called for people to repair the world. Bart Ehrman, however, sees Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet in Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, 1999. Bart Ehrman published Jesus just prior to the millennium of our time in 2000. Someone, perhaps Stephen Jay Gould, pointed out that our millennium was filled with primarily secular fears involving computer and communication breakdowns and not as many pronouncements of the second coming as might have been expected. Ehrman lays out a depiction of Jesus as believing in the apocalypse. According to the author, Jesus was an itinerant preacher who believed the world was very soon coming to an end and that God would overthrow evil. Huge numbers of people would perish in the process, but in the end, there would be peace and justice under God's reign. Ehrman believes that Jesus was convinced that this apocalypse would happen in his lifetime or his disciples' lifetimes. After Jesus died and the end of the world did not happen, Christians began to refer to his teachings as metaphysical and to forge a new concept. They maintained that the kingdom could be faithful Christians working together in a community for mutual peace and justice. Jesus was turned into a God incarnate. Ehrman takes up about 8 chapters in his volume discussing how New Testament scholars evaluate evidence in Scripture, its history, and so on. He includes an abbreviated explanation of contemporary New Testament scholarship, which will be particularly interesting to readers who have a sustained interest in biblical criticism. Ehrman explains the times that produced Jesus and states that many first-century Jews had apocalyptic ideas, some probably related to their Roman domination. He lists the sources for knowledge of Jesus: the four Gospels, the Gospel of Peter, Gnostic texts, epistles, and non-Christian literature. Finding the truth is difficult, as such texts are not wholly reliable. Ehrman explains the criteria scholars used to assess reliance. Ehrman maintains that Jesus claimed kingship, which was allegedly tacked onto his cross at his execution. This contention was not made publicly, but privately, to his disciples. All Judas needed to do was to tell the Romans such a claim, and that would be enough pretext to execute Jesus. Ehrman maintains that the understanding of Jesus needs revision. He does not believe that Jesus should be depicted as an ethicist, a family values preacher, or a preacher working for social justice. Jesus wanted followers to leave their homes and families and strive for the rapidly approaching kingdom. Many critics think Ehrman's reading of Jesus makes sense, and perhaps it is correct, but some will find R.M. Price's theory more salient. Price believes that there are many projected faces of Jesus, and that it is highly doubtful if there was an actual person. Jesus might be a compiled myth. The atheist reader, faced with many versions of Jesus and the fact that there are no original extant texts, may wonder if any objective knowledge of the historical Jesus, now in its third phase, will be found. Robert M. Price is convinced that Jesus is a mythical figure and not a historic person. He bases his argument on what he calls the three pillars or key points. First, why is there no mention of a miracle-working Jesus in secular sources of that era? Second, the epistles were written earlier than the Gospels, and those works provide no evidence of a recent historical Jesus. All that can be discovered in them is that a Jesus Christ, Son of God, came into the world to die as a sacrifice for human sin and was raised by God and enthroned in heaven. Third, the Jesus narrative is paralleled by Middle Eastern and Greek myths of dying and reviving gods such as Baal, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Dionysus, and so on. Such early myths continued into the Hellenistic and Roman world and influenced early Christian ideas. In his Deconstructing Jesus 2000, Robert M. Price has taken the concept of there being too many Jesus figures to fabricate into a salient whole a step further than earlier scholars. What he has in common with such writers is the belief that the laying out of so many theories concerning the historical Jesus sinks the entire array into a meaningless chasm of non-interpretation. It is clear that the early church authored definitions of Jesus that had a great deal to do with politics and culture and very little regard for the true identity of Jesus. Dr. Price, however, does not stop with the ancient world, but demonstrates that some scholars in the present day have created different identities of Jesus based on their own belief systems or intellectual conceptualizations. As we have just mentioned, some scholars have seen Jesus as a proponent of Cynic philosophy. Jesus' area of the country was influenced by Hellenistic ideas. There was also a strong cynical faction in that area who followed the 4th century Greek philosopher Diogenes' naturalistic tenets. There were many Essenes in Jesus' region as well. They believed in purification, heeding the Sabbath, and ritual immersion. Some scholars see Jesus as an advocate of Essenian concepts. The Gospel writers had an Essenian background and were up against the dominant Judean temple parties, according to Price. Price examines the old myths and romances that correspond to the Gospel stories. Price believes that Jesus was at best a Judaized version of the ancient mystery religions. He presents an interesting principle of biographic analogy. In other words, when one sees heroic and/or mythic elements in a story, warning signs should be attached to them. Such a principle would also include virgin birth, turning water into wine, and other miracles. They are all strong indications that the stories are myths. Burton Mack, John Crossan, and Russell Shorto have covered some of this same ground before, but Price has moved a step further. He is not a dogmatist, so he leaves the question of Jesus open enough for the reader to pursue the study on her own. Deconstructing Jesus discusses the origin of Christ's reconstruction, actual Jesus movements, Christ cults, and spends an entire chapter on Jesus' death. Price calls the entire story of Jesus' alleged death on the cross the crucifixion. Price is a member of the Jesus Seminar. However, he does not agree with the group's collective view of the historicity of Jesus or the picture of a liberal ethicist Jesus. He believes that scholars often fall down a well chasing Jesus and then see their own faces. He states, "It seems to me that Jesus must be categorized with other legendary founder figures, including the Buddha, Krishna, and Lao Tzu. There may have been a real figure there, but there is simply no longer any way of being sure." Deconstructing Jesus is a well-written, provocative volume and a welcome salvo concerning the array of meaningless identities of Jesus. Too many groups with motivations of their own co-opted this possibly unimportant or non-existent figure of Jesus and used him in the accounts they wrote to argue for their own agendas. Price is a leading scholar of Jesus studies, and his knowledge and erudition are on view in Deconstructing Jesus. Tim Callahan, author of Secret Origins of the Bible, 2002, concurs with the dying and reviving God's concept. None of Tim Callahan's information about Scripture is secret, of course, but he is quite correct in his contention that the ordinary religious congregant does not easily hear the truth concerning the Christian Bible. Biblical scholars argue among themselves about biblical inerrancy, redaction, sources, and so on, but shield the general church populations from disturbing information that might shake their mistaken beliefs. Callahan, the religion editor for Skeptic magazine, is a master of comparative mythology, languages, and literature, and has written a rich and illuminating volume. The concept that reported biblical events were versions of earlier mythological narratives is not new, but the author explains the transmission of ancient gods, goddesses, and myths to the Bible in a very scholarly, accessible, and thorough manner. He is well-versed in languages and explains language transformation, demonstrating how the names of the earliest deities became transformed into the names of Judeo-Christian biblical personages. Callahan gives a good example of transmutation of older myths into the Bible with the story of Genesis and the narrative of 6 days of creation, Adam and Eve, and the serpent. Genesis 1's creation story originated first in Mesopotamia and then in Babylonia with the god Marduk around 1400 BCE. Genesis 2's story can be traced back to Ptah, the Egyptian god, and the Greek figure Prometheus, who breathed life into man. Eve was likely the goddess Asherah, the consort of Yahweh, the Israelite god. Judaism did not become monotheistic until the 7th century BCE. Callahan states that the various creation stories are a monolithic distillation of myths in which finite gods and goddesses presented a less than perfect world. The creation and fall narratives in the Genesis are part of the greater family of mythic systems of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, according to Callahan. Readers might want to read Freeman's Who Wrote the Bible, which we discussed earlier, before attempting Callahan. Freeman supplies an understanding of the fermenting political culture the early biblical scribes lived and worked in. Callahan then provides an exegesis for many biblical narratives, chapter by chapter, including Isaac, Noah and the flood, Abraham and Jacob, the 12 Israelite tribes, the Egyptian Exodus, and Samson. He elucidates their relation to past narratives of other peoples. Both of these scholars will open up new vistas for atheists and other secular people interested in the ancient origins of biblical tales. Callahan has researched the mythic origins of Jesus' nativity, passion, and resurrection narrative in the New Testament and finds the story is based on earlier dying and reviving God myths from the Near East. He is of the opinion that the ancient exclusionary myths of Jewish and Palestinian people in the Mideast are helping to keep the two states from a viable peace in the present day. Callahan also discusses myths that influence United States culture. He would like to make people more aware how our modern belief systems in the 21st century are based on a primitive thought structure. Such fables are still influencing our attempt to find solutions to enormous social difficulties with mythology rather than reason. Callahan discusses the deep psychological needs of people and how the biblical stories resonate with the reality beyond literal truth for many. Secret Origins Callahan is well versed in ancient history, archaeology, linguistics, numismatics, and more, which equips him to delve into scriptural truth with scholarship and depth. George A. Wells, in his scholarly article in the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief, cited in AtheistScholar.org, presents a different concept of Jesus. He believes that Jesus was superimposed on the figure of wisdom, a female primordial consort of God who sat at his side and helped create the world. The Q tradition describes both Jesus and John the Baptist as human messengers sent by wisdom to prepare for the imminent arrival of a supernatural Son of Man who would effect a terrible and final judgment. In sum, states Wells, the Jesus of the early epistles is not the Jesus of the Gospels. He goes on to explain that the theological world is once again involved in a quest for the historical Jesus. This will be the third search. The first two ended in failure and were more for the purpose of finding theological proof than as historical projects. We shall see what the third quest will uncover. The conclusion to be drawn from such deep and exhaustive research is that each era and each scholar creates its own Jesus. There is no conclusive evidence of a historical Jesus in the Gospels, the epistles, or Roman sources. The likelihood of success for the third quest for this historical Jesus is minimal. A skeptical stance seems to be the correct course concerning the historicity of Jesus. The end of biblical studies. It is certain that the Bible is a document with serious moral, historical, factual, and archaeological flaws. Hector Avalos, a biblical scholar, calls for an end to biblical studies in the End to Biblical Studies 2007. Avalos first discusses the well-documented flaws of the Bible. Then, more interestingly, he provides a listing of the organizations, publications, and media which he believes combine to keep Bible studies alive as an institution. He calls this aggregate the infrastructure of biblical studies. Avalos criticizes Academe, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Journal of Biblical Literature, as well as the media publishing complex, books, film, and television, for continuing the pretense that the Bible has significance for contemporary life. He states that there should be an end to the field of biblical studies, that we know what we can concerning the Bible and its history by now. He maintains that the remainder of the unsolved problems concerning biblical criticism and truth verifications may never be resolved. Avalos makes two significant points. He believes that modern biblical scholarship has shown that the Bible is a product of cultures whose values and beliefs about the origin, nature, and purpose of our world are no longer held to be relevant. His second point is that in the face of significant irrelevance, the profession of academic biblical study still pretends to be consequential. Such a fruitless masquerade is carried out by practicing so-called scholarly disciplines that are often flawed, such as the production of mistranslation, skewed histories, and so on. Avos believes the very thought processes and concept formation of those ancient biblical peoples, particularly in the area of ethics and morality, are foreign to the modern world, irrelevant, and often harmful. Jacques Berliner Blau, in the Secular Bible, Why Non-Believers Must Take Religion Seriously, 2005, calls for a secular Bible studies program, but does not make prescriptive suggestions to move such a program forward. He points out that the Bible's diverse messages and contradictory readings influence us in ways that are not so much knowingly thought about and rationally assessed as they are enacted on a daily basis in a reflex-like manner. Berliner Blau reminds readers that the seemingly godless economic calendar that mandates days of rest and days of labor still largely adheres to a religiously inflected calendar. Berliner Blau is a formidable scholar of ancient Near Eastern languages and sociology. He has written a concise, erudite, and witty critique of the fabrication of the Old Testament and offers some cautions to readers concerning paying attention to religion's claims. He proposes a secular hermeneutics interpretations. Berliner Blau believes that attitudes from the Bible, perpetuated by fundamentalists, are rampant in American culture. He thinks that secularists should take up the task of adding to biblical scholarship with their own outlook and methodology. Secular Bible offers an interesting proposition. Berliner Blau maintains that secular hermeneutics should give up any interpretive project that attempts to ascertain what an earlier author or editor was trying to say in the numerous biblical copies that have been handed down. He thinks that there are so many possible meanings that most attempts to untangle interpretation fall into what he calls the meaningless jungle of the Hebrew Bible. He believes that the new secular hermeneutics should reject the notion that the text of the Old Testament is coherent at all. Berliner Blau discusses the state of Bible studies in academia and finds it is not held in much esteem by other academics. Bible study, with some exceptions, is still in the hands of the religious and is suspected of boosterism. Indeed, he is correct. Even some religious Bible exegetes complain about church governing bodies and ministers who, either from ignorance or unwillingness to discuss biblical errors and inaccuracies, keep ordinary Christian congregations in ignorance of biblical difficulties. Such a cover-up creates shock for some believers when they are faced with the truth. Berliner Blau does not chart a course or offer a set of prescriptive methods, as we have said before, for a secular study of the Bible, but rather opens the question up for consideration. Personal commitment to Christian truth and reconciling the errors of the Bible is rampant in biblical studies and merely forwards more confusion. Secular Bible discusses two cultural examples of the Bible's extreme openness of interpretation: intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles and homosexuality. He notes that exegetes, whether conservative Christians or gay supporters, write on biblical pronouncement as gays or as fundamentalists. Each group tries to interpret the Bible for their side. He hopes for a time when interpreters will write about conclusions that are not necessarily in line with their personal convictions. For example, some interpreters have written objectively and against their own point of view that Leviticus 20:13 condemns the penetrator caught in a homosexual act to death. The passive partner may also be condemned, but this is unclear. Most civilized exegetes find such a stipulation repugnant, but there is no use trying to whitewash Leviticus. Berliner Blau would like to see more truth statements concerning biblical passages rather than attempts to demonstrate that the Bible is with one's own party. And now we turn to archaeology, and the Bible is seen to be a failure when studied from that discipline as well. Neil Asher Silberman and Israel Finkelstein in The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the origin of its sacred text, 2002, have demonstrated that there is almost no archaeological proof for the events in the Old Testament. In fact, the Bible narration has been steadily chipped away by archaeological findings in recent years. If you recall, Freeman's Who Wrote the Bible makes many of the same points as Silberman and Finkelstein. It would seem that around 630 to 600 BCE in Jerusalem, under the reign of King Josiah, a national epic was compiled as a means of propaganda to unite and energize the population with tales of past glory and grandeur. Despite the archaeological findings, both Silberman, a well-known author on archaeology, and Finkelstein, director of Tel Aviv University's excavations at Megiddo, attempt to salvage the Bible and preserve it as a purveyor of a great legend. However, their findings and conclusions are impeccable. The results of their investigation are devastating to any claims of the Bible being the true history of the Israelite people. There is no evidence of Exodus. There is no written record of a large group of slaves leaving Egypt at one time. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, and there is no possibility that such an event would not be recorded. Rather, there were probably many small movements that took place over a long period of time, according to Silberman and Finkelstein. There is no evidence for a decisive military conquest by Israel over the Canaanites around 1200 BCE. The Canaanite towns at that period were small, undefended villages with no mighty walls to topple. There is a mention of a King David, but no evidence that David or his son Solomon, who might be a historical personage, ever reigned over a large area from Mesopotamia to Egypt or built wealthy palaces. The dates for the period mentioned would be about 1000 to 900 BCE. There is no evidence of any architecture that is monumental. In fact, Jerusalem was a small, rather poor village at that period. Abraham and the other patriarchs were supposedly active around 2000 BCE. The stories about them are replete with camel caravans. The problem is that camels became domesticated and used no earlier than 1000 BCE. The book of Deuteronomy, which brought all the 5 books of the Bible up to date, was discovered in the walls of the temple rebuilding around 620 BCE. The economic and cultural conditions of this later era seem to be in some accord with the biblical descriptions of an earlier time. Deuteronomy even confirms the reforms King Josiah was pushing through prior to his death, which was around 600 BCE. As happens so often in historical accounts, the past is used to serve people's present needs. The secular community continues to make dents in the huge religious, political, economic confluence that keeps our society entrapped within the conceptual paradigm of an outmoded document replete with violence, rage, injustice, superstition, and supernatural events. Our secular scholars chip away at the monumental fraud of the Christian Bible. Bit by bit, we will someday supplant its dark and puzzling vision with a secular one of clarity, science, and reason. Attempting to find guidance from it and believing in its credibility is injuring us in formulating sensible and humane ethics and morals, and helping keep people apart by reinforcing ancient and outworn enmities. The secular community looks forward with anticipation to the dawning of the rising sun of reason, which will dispel the fog of an ancient, irrelevant, and nonsensical document from an ancient world that we no longer understand nor relate to. Thank you for your attention this evening.